Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Michael Luo. Michael is the executive editor of the New Yorker magazine. In this interview, we discussed his new book, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. As I said to Michael in the introduction to our conversation, I felt as if reading his book, scales of ignorance fell from my eyes. That is, he reveals in this book stories which I simply did not know, major trajectories in American history of which I was altogether ignorant. And we discuss the importance of historical excavation of difficult stories, not for the sake of merely fueling anger, which might accomplish no historical good, but instead to excavate such stories to help us in turn do the hard work of navigating difference, of learning better to love our neighbors, which must first be fueled by that historical excavation. Fascinating stories, troubling stories. Here's Michael Luo. Here on No Small Endeavor, we explore what it means to live a good life with the help of impassioned guests like public theologian Dr. Russell Moore. At Christianity Today, Russell heads up the Public Theology Project as editor-in-chief and hosts the popular podcast, The Russell Moore Show, and has twice been a guest on No Small Endeavor. On The Russell Moore Show, Russell hosts the likes of Pulitzer Prize-winning author Marilyn Robinson, musician Andrew Peterson, and former Governor John Kasich, along with other authors, artists, and politicians doing good work in the world, looking for signposts of the work of God in troubling times. So make The Russell Moore Show part of your weekly listening routine. Follow and listen to The Russell Moore Show wherever you get your podcasts. I am not big into fads. I prefer stuff that works, which reminds me of Quince, where I've gotten some summer attire that fits right, feels good, and lasts. That's gotten my lovely wife Laura also shopping at Quince, and she likes my Quince linen shorts and my really good-looking new Quince summer linen shirt. Quince has the kind of stuff you'll actually wear on repeat. I'm wearing mine on repeat, like breathable flow knit polos, crisp cotton shirts, and comfortable lightweight pants that somehow work for both weekend hangs and dressed up dinners. The best part? Everything with Quince is half the cost of similar brands. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices. Stick to the staples that last with elevated essentials from Quince. Go to quince.com/endeavor for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/endeavor to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/endeavor.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Michael Luo is an executive editor at The New Yorker and writes regularly for the magazine on politics, religion, and Asian American issues. Before joining the magazine in 2016, he spent 13 years at the New York Times as a national correspondent, metro reporter, and investigative reporter. He's a recipient of a George Polk Award and a Livingston Award for Young Journalists. His first book was recently published, entitled Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. He's a second-generation Chinese American and lives in New York City with his wife and 2 children. Welcome, Michael.
Lee, it's great to be here.
I'm really pleased to have you with us and grateful to get to spend some time with you today. Because of my work both as host of No Small Endeavor and also as an academic, I get to read a lot. And these days I don't often find myself with a sense that some blinding scales of ignorance just fell from my eyes. But I must say that I felt so much reading your recent book that I feel so ignorant about all of this. And I'm grateful for the way you have served us in doing such work and done so with such grace and such a compelling narrative. So thank you for that. You share in your new book, Strangers in the Land, about an incident in Manhattan that first prompted your writing. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, this was the fall of 2016, October. We were just a few weeks away from Trump's election. I wasn't expecting it. I don't think the world was expecting it. But you could feel a curtain of nativism, I feel like, that was descending on the country. Um, this was a Sunday after church, and my family and I were on the Upper East Side, and we were with some other families looking for a place to eat. We were all Asian American. We were blocking the sidewalk, and this woman, a white woman, well dressed, looked like she could have been a parent in my kids' preschool, brushed past us, aggravated. We were in her way, and she muttered, or didn't mutter, but just said, go back to China. And even though it was the Sunday after church, sadly I did not turn the other cheek. I abandoned my younger daughter in her stroller, which was not a good idea, and ran after the woman, really, and kind of got in their face a little bit. Essentially, what I remember was along the lines of, "Are you serious? Did you really just say that?" We went back and forth, and she screamed at us, at me, down the block, "Go back to your effing country." And I was trying to think of what to say. The adrenaline is rushing, and I was trying to think of something smart. And I said, "I was born in this country." This is yelled, screamed down the sidewalk. And I tweeted about this. It was kind of in the heyday of Twitter, and I was kind of live tweeting what happened. And I used this hashtag, "This is 2016," trying to make the point of we're in the year 2016 and this is still happening. And I ended up writing a piece for the New York Times where I worked at that point about this incident. And at the encouragement of an editor, I wrote it as an open letter to her. And I wrote about this feeling, the sensation of otherness that is common in the Asian American experience. And I also wrote about this feeling of sadness that I had as I walked away that day with pushing my younger daughter in her stroller and having my older daughter next to me. They're 2 generations removed from my parents' immigrant experience. My parents came in the 1960s to the United States from Taiwan. They had fled mainland China when in the communist takeover. And so that means my kids are, 2 generations removed. And I was wondering and thinking about whether they'll ever feel like they truly belonged in this country. And that piece, rather extraordinarily, we published it and it became its own viral thing. The next day, the editors, the top editors of the New York Times, decided to publish it on the front page of the newspaper, which is an extraordinary decision given the subject and given the format of the piece. And that generated its own, it's almost like I felt like it was several weeks of conversation about race in America and being Asian American. And I talk about how this moment, which is an ordinary moment, but because of the platform I have, turned into a larger conversation. And the thing I felt actually, though, I joked about how for a couple of weeks, I felt like I was the face of Asian America. I was on panels, I was doing interviews on MSNBC. It really resonated. It traveled very, very far, this open letter. The Times also shot a video, or actually put together a video where they asked people from around the country to send in videos direct to camera of their own experiences with this kind of incident, and it generated its own outpouring. And that video went viral. And I just remember being at a Barnes and Noble's with my daughter, and somebody came up to me and it's like, "Are you Michael Luo?" Because they had seen that video. Anyways, and what that moment, though, being that face of Asian America, as I joked, for a couple of weeks, what I realized actually, though, was I actually didn't feel equipped. I felt there's a lot of history and context that plays into this kind of perpetual foreigner syndrome, that plays into this kind of otherness that I was talking about. And I actually didn't really know that history. And I just remember, actually, I was on a panel with a guy named Jelani Cobb, who's a historian by training. He's my colleague now at the New Yorker, staff writer at the New Yorker. Jelani, we were on a panel together and we were talking about race, and Jelani speaks in these incredible full paragraphs about the African-American experience, about civil rights, about post-Reconstruction, all of that. And I was just this guy who had this thing happen to me. And that stuck with me. And that came a couple of years later. I went to the New Yorker and the pandemic happened, and we experienced that surge in violence against Asian Americans during the pandemic. And I wrote a piece for the New Yorker that drew on this history. And in some ways, this book that I wrote and is kind of my response to that moment that happened to me, and my desire to know that history for myself and to convey it to a broader audience.
Yeah, thank you. So as we turn to the book, there's so many particulars I want to dig in as time allows, but could you maybe just give us like a one paragraph overview summary of what you do in the book?
Yeah, the book, my elevator pitch for the book is that it's a narrative history of Chinese exclusion in America from the gold rush to the 1960s, when my parents came to America. The Chinese immigrants started to come to the United States in large numbers in the gold rush, and it was this global migration around the world. All these people from European backgrounds to Black Americans to Chinese to there are these people called Californios, who are Mexican settlers of California. There were indigenous people. It was this unprecedented global migration to the Pacific Coast, as it was called back then. And to me, it was this extraordinary experiment in truly multiracial democracy that we had not experienced up to that point. And my book tells the story of how we fared in that experiment.
The story, as I indicated there as I was opening, I think the overarching story of exclusion was, I knew very little about it, and I certainly knew, I think, nothing about some of these horrific instances of such sharp violence and such widespread instance of such violence. But kind of maybe give us some particulars of what did this work of exclusion look like in some of its particulars?
Yeah. So the thing that people do, if they do know any of this history, is they are familiar with the term the Chinese Exclusion Act, which passed in 1882. And it was a law that barred Chinese laborers from entering the country for 10 years. And this represented the culmination, particularly in the 1870s, there was an economic downturn in the 1870s, and it really caused this anti-Chinese movement to really accelerate, as there were just legions of laborers, white working class people who were out of work in California. And they were also joined by, I think, small business owners, others who felt, I think, kind of stuck economically. And the country was deeply polarized between Democrats and Republicans, and both parties, Republicans, remember, were the party of Lincoln that freed the slaves and ostensibly stood for liberty and equality and these kinds of things. But after the Civil War, after the vanquishing of Reconstruction in the South, as both parties were looking for party supremacy, they needed the West Coast. They were courting the votes on the West Coast to win the presidency, win Congress, and that kind of thing. And that became very important and wound up in the passage of this law, the Chinese, which is known today as the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was actually a series of laws that kind of got progressively more onerous in the ensuing years and decades until Chinese exclusion became a permanent law in the early 1900s. The violence that you're talking about
Before we go to that, so the Chinese Exclusion Act itself, in effect, bars Chinese as immigrants to the United States.
Yeah, it marked the first time that the United States had barred an entire people based on race from entering the country. It says that it singled out Chinese laborers, but the way it was interpreted by the inspectors of the ports who were in charge of enforcing the law is effectively barring all Chinese. That's the way they interpreted it. They made it very, very difficult for any Chinese person to enter the country. Students, merchants, they were just skeptical of everybody, and so it didn't. What ended up happening though is the Chinese continued to find ways to enter the country and find ways around the laws. They were either said they were merchants, which gave them an exemption, or another thing that happened is many of them started to claim American citizenship. They said that if you were born in this country, then you're an American citizen, then you're able to enter the country. And there is basically frustration built up. They passed this law in 1882, and all these communities on the West Coast, I think, got frustrated, and these residents of the West Coast decided to take matters into their own hands. And in 1885, 1886, nearly 200 communities on the West Coast drove out the Chinese in their midst, which is it's this period that is known as the driving out. And like you, I didn't know anything about this history, and it's an incredible series of events, and there's just one horrific episode after another, and and it's pretty extraordinary to me. They're essentially almost like American style pogroms, really, and the most one of the most horrific episodes took place in Rock Springs when 28 Chinese miners were killed and the Chinese quarter was burned down.
And this was Rock Springs, Wyoming.
Yeah, this is Rock Springs in the Wyoming territory. So that driving out period is the emotional heart of the book. But in the end, they didn't succeed. The aim of these people was to expel the Chinese and to drive them from the country, but the Chinese persisted, and in the 20th century, their numbers started to go up again. And to me, what I see is this incredible story of resilience and persistence in the face of bigotry and violence.
Some of the parallels, it seems, between the 1870s, 80s, and our own day are just really remarkable. But you have rather than me recite them, what do you see as some of the most significant parallels between actual policies that were implemented in the 1870s and 80s and policies that are being experimented with again today?
Oh, there are these, I don't know if you call them cliches or truths. Mark Twain supposedly said, although as far as I can tell, maybe it's apocryphal, that, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And you see so much rhyming from this period. If from the, I mentioned the economic downturn, I think was a big part of this. The fact that the labor movement, this was the early days of the labor movement. A lot of the people who led the anti-Chinese movement were labor leaders, and they railed against corporate power and corporate greed and that kind of thing. But they, at the heart of their message was this scapegoating of a people. That's what the parallels, I see a lot of that. When you think of the MAGA movement today, this kind of nimbus of outrage that, heavily centered on white working class people. I see a lot of parallels with the drivers of this anti-Chinese movement. I think it relates to, the MAGA movement is very, very hard to. Some of my colleagues and I, we talk about, like, what is the black box that is upstream from the Trumpism, and I think that's very difficult to figure out. It's a mix, and just like I think we see in the anti-Chinese movement. I think it was race, it was religion, it was economics. It was all of these things. This toxic stew, and and you see things like you see things like obviously there's this. We're in an anti-immigrant moment right now. There's talk today of mass deportations. There was talk then, actually, of mass deportations, and actually ran into the same practical problems that mass deportations today would run into, which is they didn't have the money to do this. There actually was this moment. It was a pretty extraordinary moment. In 1892, there was a law that was passed called the Geary Law that was related to the Chinese exclusion laws that required that all Chinese in the United States register and be photographed and be registered. And the Chinese, this extraordinary act of civil disobedience, decided to resist. None of them, very, very few registered, and they pooled their money, asked everybody to contribute $1 to this legal fund that they hired, well-known, prominent white lawyers, and they took this case all the way to the Supreme Court. In the end, they lost, and in the end, the Chinese ended up registering. But in this period, when they had refused to register, there was talk of deporting all of them. And the Commerce Department said, we actually only have this amount of money in the treasury. We can't do this. And so, anyways, the parallels are many.
I think I read something that you even kind of have parallels like separating parents from children.
Yeah, there was in this history. There's a couple of episodes that are in the book that are like this. There was a story. I think this was early 1900s. There was this really notorious Chinese inspector, and they detained a boy, a Chinese boy, and while they were questioning him, his parents were in the country, and so he was trying to be reunited with them, and they went and checked on him and things like that, and then all of a sudden they found that he was gone, and it turned out that he had been put aboard a ship and sent home, and then somebody had seen him get off in Shanghai, I think it was, and so very similar stories of today. There was also a story that I tell in the book later at Angel Island, which became a place where a lot of Chinese were held and interrogated, of a woman who arrived with several of her children, and her husband was an American citizen and had died, and her children were born in America. And this family actually went back in America for several generations. But because of her legal status, the fact that her husband had died, who was the American citizen, she was in this kind of legal limbo, and they detained her on Angel Island for more than a year, separating her from her children. In the end, she was in the end paroled and kind of freed and reunited, and her family can now go one of the I think it's the it's the daughter of it's the granddaughter of this woman who was detained on Angel Island is somebody who has been very helpful. Her name is Connie Young Yu, and she's a community historian today, and it's a pretty extraordinary thing. When I've been doing events for this book, I ask the audience is there anyone here who's of Chinese descent who can trace their family stories back 5 generations? And in San Francisco, a lot of people stand up. It's a pretty extraordinary thing.
So the 14th Amendment, following the Civil War, establishes birthright citizenship for all former slaves born in the U.S., and yet there's an exclusion here as well for Chinese Americans where they're not allowed to claim birthright citizenship in the United States. That was another thing that just kind of blew my mind. Because that's a story that I was just completely unaware of.
Yeah, this is the story of Wong Kim Ark, which established the legal precedent of birthright citizenship that is the precedent that stands today, although is being challenged today by the Trump administration. And what you're referring to is the 14th Amendment. One of the things that it did after the Civil War was it clarified the status of these formerly enslaved Black Americans, and it says in the first clause that if you're born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you're a citizen of the United States. And so that ensured that Black Americans got all the rights and privileges of other citizens. And what happened in this case is people in the anti-Chinese movement, people who are opposed to the Chinese president of the United States, obviously they're very concerned about the emergence of a native-born, American-born generation of Chinese that would be citizens and then would exercise power at the ballot box, and that was a great fear of folks in the anti-Chinese movement. And so they tried to. There was a guy named George Collins who was a kind of, to me, strikes me as an eccentric lawyer in San Francisco. He developed this legal theory that said that Chinese who are American-born are they're not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. He seized on that clause in the 14th Amendment, tried to say that their parents were subjects of the Chinese Empire, and so they're not really they shouldn't be able to claim American citizenship. And this case, so Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco. He had gone back and forth to China a couple times, and when you came back in, you need to bring verification, these letters that the people vouched for him that he was born in San Francisco, and they were looking to make a test case of this question about this clause about subject to the jurisdiction there of challenging birthright citizenship. And again, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court affirmed birthright citizenship. And it was interesting, when you read the decision, it's very dense with all kinds of common law precedent and things like that. And but there was the justice who wrote the majority opinion pointed out that if they didn't affirm birthright citizenship based on this principle, there would be millions of descendants of white European immigrants whose citizenship would be come into question, and that was just beyond the pale, unacceptable. And so that was a really important linchpin of this decision. And so, and today, interestingly, the legal argument that is being made against birthright citizenship today by Donald Trump in some ways actually mirrors that challenge back then. They actually are focusing on that same clause in trying to make the case that it shouldn't apply to people who have parents who are at least one parent who's an undocumented immigrant or not here on a permanent basis. And so, yeah, it's fascinating that it's that it's back in dispute with a different group.
You noted a moment ago the parallels in economic anxieties between the late 1800s and our own day, and the way in which that has yielded anti-immigrant sensibilities, and yet at the same time that it was a misplaced anxiety, that it missed its mark. And you talked in the book about how expelling Chinese workers did not, in fact, help white workers. Could you unpack that for us a bit?
Yeah, so that it's interesting that some of we have historians who have studied this, and actually economists who have looked at this. And one of the findings is that actually Chinese laborers and white laborers, despite the fears about this, weren't actually for the most part, in the same labor pools, that they were competing for different jobs, and it was usually, more menial, lower paying jobs that Chinese workers were in. The interesting thing, I actually didn't get into this in the book, but I wrote about it in a comment a piece I wrote for the New Yorker. More recently, there has been some economists who have actually taken advantage of kind of aggregated economic data, and they've looked across all the states, the Western states, that had a fair number of Chinese workers, and they looked at the outcomes for white workers after Chinese exclusion passed, and they found actually the economic outcomes were not better, and what their conclusion is that some of the things that were lost in terms things like synergies of effort, and when there are white workers and Chinese workers together in a factory or things like that, for a variety of reasons, some of those advantages were lost after Chinese exclusion, and it actually didn't turn out to be a good thing for white workers, the passage of Chinese exclusion, which mirrors some of the studies today that talk about the importance of immigrants in the American economy today.
If you care about faith in everyday life, including the news you consume, then I recommend you check out Christianity Today's flagship news podcast, The Bulletin, hosted by No Small Endeavor friends Russell Moore, Mike Cosper, and Clarissa Mall. The Bulletin keeps Christians up to date on the events, questions, and people that are shaping their world. It's a news commentary show that seeks to leave you enlivened, not exhausted, inspired, not downtrodden. Listen to The Bulletin every Tuesday and Thursday and discover how the good news can inform and transform a bad news world. Subscribe to The Bulletin wherever you listen to podcasts today. This week, one of my colleagues was asking about how I was liking cassava, and I replied, very much. She knew I had an extra stock at hand and asked if there were any way she could try some, and I said, no. I like it too much, so much so that it engendered my selfishness. I'm serious. I look forward to the occasions I get to enjoy my cassava whole body meal shake, and beneath the great taste is great stuff, keeping body and mind nourished all day. I continue to be especially pleased that every serving has 25 grams of plant protein, and that with every 2 scoops of cassava you get 85 plus superfoods, nutrients, and plant-based ingredients. I typically use it as a meal replacement or a mid-afternoon boost before heading to the YMCA for a workout. You can try cassava risk-free with their Love It guarantee. Fuel your day with cassava. Go to cassava.com and use code ENDEAVOR for 15% off your next order. That's cassava, KACHAVA.com, code ENDEAVOR for 15% off. Now, if they could just make a shake for the soul to make me less selfish. If you, like me, find yourself fascinated, sometimes unsettled by the ways fear and faith intersect in American life, let me recommend a podcast I think you'll appreciate. It's called Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. It's a deeply reported series that dives headfirst into the satanic panic of the 1980s and 90s, a time when politics, religious fervor, and flawed memory converged, and the results sent innocent people to prison, tore apart communities, and shaped a generation's understanding of evil. What makes this podcast compelling is not just the history, but it's the lens through which it's told. The hosts ask hard questions about how pastors, therapists, and law enforcement got swept up in a moral panic and what it means for us today. Devil and the Deep Blue Sea is a production of Christianity Today. All episodes are available to binge listen right now, so don't miss out. Listen to Devil and the Deep Blue Sea wherever you get your podcasts. When you think about the sort of social hostility that drove these drivings out and this extensive hostility, I often in therapeutic circles, I'll hear people who are in that world talk about how anger often is a helpful construct because it points to the way in which somebody's maybe violating a boundary. And so if we feel like somebody's violating something that's rightfully due to us, and anger can be our friend in helping us push back against that, or note to us that some sort of boundary needs to be redrawn. And here what we have is a sort of anger, a widespread anger, given what you just indicated, that simply is a misinformed emotional reaction, right? And so I wonder for you, somebody who's doing very high levels of journalism and often would be having your finger on the pulse of widespread social anger around whatever issue. As you look at that, how would you suggest that when we experience anger about some supposed social movement, what we should do with that, how we should interrogate that?
That's a good question. I think the thing that I take away from working on this book and some reporting I've done in my past is that difference is hard. That you can sense it in yourself. Like, it's interesting. Even when I walk around Flushing, which is or Chinatown in New York, where there's a lot of Chinese immigrants, and I understand and speak Mandarin, although in some cases people are speaking other dialects, and you feel this difference, and I'm just saying that as another Chinese person, actually a person of Chinese descent, albeit somebody born in the United States. When you look at your friend groups, or you look at your churches, there's a reason why Martin Luther King said that Sunday mornings are the most segregated hour in America. I did a story once. I did a lot of writing on reporting. I did a lot of reporting on religion, and I did a story about Asian American churches that were trying to become multi-ethnic. And so these were, in many cases, the Asian American church starts as a Korean language or a Chinese language church, and then a second generation takes hold, and they're trying to, become not just a Korean church or a Chinese church and a multi-Asian, multi-racial, multi-ethnic church. And I was examining the phenomenon of why it was so hard, actually, for a lot of these churches. They have really struggled. And I think this truism that I'm talking about, that difference is difficult, is hard, is part of that explanation. And when I look at what happened on the Pacific Coast when the arrival of all of these people who spoke a different language, who looked different, they had queues, these braids that because they were subjects of the Qing Empire and the men were required to wear these queues. They had a different religion. They were a different race. And I think we have difficulty with that, human nature-wise, and I think also more on a macro basis, I think our democracy struggles with it, and so the thing that I think I want people to think about when there are very real and rational discussions to be had about immigration, how much immigration's, the rules around immigration and what to do with people who are here illegally and that kind of thing. Or to just take another thing that's just very big in the news right now, which is the kind of crackdown on the decoupling that's happening with our relationship with China. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, just said that we're going to aggressively revoke the visas of Chinese international students, those with affiliations with the Communist Party, although I think almost everybody, if you dig deep enough in among Chinese international students, will have some connection to the Communist Party, or people who are in critical fields. So we are there is that policy decision is based on a belief that we're in this competition with geopolitical competition for technology, military, and economic supremacy with China. The thing, though, that I know, and the thing that I'm afraid of, is the way this human nature creeps in. Also, I don't like to use the term white supremacy because I feel like it can be, it's sometimes overused, misunderstood, that kind of thing. But when I hear Rubio, when I see him doing this, or I see Trump talking about China, as like when he says the word China, it just comes across as a sneer. That's what I hear. I just think that it's the lesson of history is that race is part of this. A lot of this discussion around cracking down on immigration relates to difference in race, and there's this question. I use this line from this novel, Interior Chinatown, as the epigraph to my book. The Interior Chinatown is this novel where this main character is a background actor in a TV show about a black cop and a white cop, and it's called Black and White, and it's kind of an indictment of the way race in America is viewed largely through the lens of black and white. The main character is a background actor who's generic Asian man. His greatest aspiration in life is to become Kung Fu guy. And he gives this soliloquy in a courtroom. It's kind of a imaginary courtroom scene, and he's making this argument in this court, and he says, who gets to be an American? What does an American look like? And then he goes on, well, why do we keep falling out of the story, even though we've been here nearly 200 years? And so that question of who gets to be an American, that's the thing that we've struggled with, for nearly since the birth of the Republic. So I just think that you need to bring that lens to any of these discussions.
One of the things I found, these kind of inconsistent tensions in myself as I was reading much of your book, and that is that on the one hand, I surprisingly found this sort of perverse comfort in it, in that I didn't know all this stuff, and it's a horrible episode after horrible episode that was shocking to me. And so the comfort wasn't there. The comfort was in, oh my, we've done this stuff before, and we've also found ways to try to find a better self, a better national self than these horrors. And so there was a sort of kind of perverse comfort in that. And then at the same time, on the other hand, there was this sort of realization, continued realization, I knew this already, but this sort of continued realization that there's a sort of violence and exclusion that seems to be in the DNA of the experiment that is America. But I don't know, any thoughts or feedback to my experience in reading these stories?
You know, I think the book in the end, for all of its the darkness in it, is a hopeful book. And I think that some of that relates to the story of resilience that I think is the narrative arc of the book. And I've been really pleased that some of the folks who have reviewed the book have talked about how it's surprisingly hopeful, and it's actually a bit of a balm in this moment where we're experiencing similar anti-immigrant sentiment. So I think that the way that you're reacting to the book is one, what I was trying to do. I was hoping, that I could pull off as a storyteller, and two, something that others can relate to. The other part of that you sense this kind of cyclical nature of things, and how this story of America, we keep failing this test, but it's also, we're working towards that more perfect union. I have struggled with this question of, people have asked me, are you optimistic? And I've struggled with it because if you understand history, you understand the way we have failed this test again and again. The way that this is a story. I mean, the Chinese question was being debated at the same time as Reconstruction was being eradicated in the South. The indigenous peoples were being expelled and killed in the West. All of this stuff, this history, when that really kind of represented a testing of our founding ideals, all of this stuff was happening around the same time, and all of these histories continue to refract in American life. But I guess I feel like we have no choice but to lean in and keep working at it and being intentional about it. That's what other choice do we have? I don't think we can't afford to throw up our hands.
Yeah. One last question about the book, and or asking you for some commentary upon my own experience and some of your experience that you noted earlier. I grew up in Alabama and went to college, studied computer science, decided I was going to go to seminary. And so I moved out to Texas to go to seminary in West Texas in Abilene. And my first year in seminary, I'm listening to a professor do some lecturing on the American Civil Rights Movement. And it starts talking about this episode of the firebombing of a bus in Alabama. And I start digging around, and I realize that infamous firebombing happened about 15 miles, 20 miles from where I grew up. And here I was in another state in my early 20s, and this was the first time I had ever heard this story that I remembered. And so I was just shocked at my ignorance of this, that so many people in the country knew, and yet there I was growing up there and didn't know it. It happened the year before I was born, but still, I didn't know about it. And so then I'm reading the stories that you share of episode after episode of horrific violence, and it's completely new to me. And so I start wondering, what is there about? Is it simply white privilege, white Southern man privilege, that means I can get by fine without knowing these stories? But then I also heard you say you didn't know some of these stories as a Chinese American man. But I also began to wonder, well, you're also, if we can speak very bluntly, you're a Chinese American man who went to Harvard, right? And so there's a certain privilege there as well. So how would you account for the way in which such ignorance is effectuated or operates?
Well, it's the way, history is written by the powerful, and the powerless are often left out of it. And so it takes real intentional work by great historians to excavate this history and to elevate the voices of the Chinese themselves, and all of those stories that we talked about. I think that there has been an intervention. For example, I feel like in the last couple of years there have been some big histories about indigenous people and Native American history that have made their way into the won prizes, have made their way into the public consciousness, and they're trying to make that intervention that this history of indigenous people, Native Americans, is part of American history. And that's some of what I'm trying to do with this history for Chinese Americans, for Asian Americans, because so that the struggle for Asian Americans is one of invisibility, and I mentioned interior Chinatown, which is the way that race in America is often viewed solely through this lens of black and white, and where do Asian Americans fit in? I think that's part of it, and that's part of what I'm trying to do with this book. But this is also why these history wars that are happening right now matter, and the way history is told, it matters, and that, like I said, that line in Interior Chinatown of, we keep falling out of the story even though we've been here nearly 200 years. That's what I'm trying to do in this book, is write us back into the story. There is this kind of rallying cry these days of Asian American history is American history. And when I look at the world of books, and whenever I go to bookstores, I go to the history section, the nonfiction section, the history section. There are all kinds of books on Civil War, on World War II, Civil Rights era. I like to see there isn't usually a section for a book like mine, and I think this is a popular history. It's written in a narrative style that I think it's a compelling, a fast read, and just pulls you along. And I think of myself above all as a storyteller, and my hope is that the person who is just generally interested in that person, that dad. It's that Father's Day is coming up. That dad who's gonna, you might think of like, oh, you're gonna get them the World War II history. Maybe think about getting them Strangers in the Land.
I understand that you became a Christian as an undergraduate at Harvard, and I'm wondering how, if at all, that factored into your decision to become a journalist.
Yeah, I have always been an idealistic person. I don't know. I think just growing up, I was always interested in making a difference. I think when I became a Christian, it gave that kind of moral ambition, I think, which is so important. The thing that I worry about with young people, and the thing I'm passionate about is like that is actually one of the great gifts of the job that I have as a journalist. Is I feel like it matters, and it makes a difference in people's lives, and allows me to live a life of moral ambition. One of my favorite verses is Micah 6:8. Oh man, what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's been a life verse, and when I was in that kind of formative period in college, and thinking about what I was going to do with my life, and it happened that I became a Christian in college. All of that stuff was happening in my life at the same time, and I was always a good writer. I read a lot as a kid. I didn't necessarily think I wasn't one of those people who always knew I was going to go into journalism. I actually thought I was going to do journalism for a little bit and then go to law school. And I took a job after college at the LA Times, and never looked back. And the thing I think that's really cool is, if you're lucky, you get to be in a job in journalism where you can bring every part of you to the job, and I think I have, and this book is part of that.
What would you say from your faith? How would you say that your faith sets for you some sort of lens for the particular stories in which you are especially interested?
So the thing two things. Particularly when you start out in journalism, you don't get to choose what you cover. You're one of my jobs when I was early in my journalism career, I worked at Newsday, the newspaper on Long Island, and I covered the Suffolk County Police Department. And so one of the tasks that you did when you were the police reporter for Newsday on Long Island is we covered every single fatal car accident on Long Island. There's and I still remember, because like there's in the system there was a slug, and and it would be LI, stands for Long Island, because the Long Island edition of Newsday, and then kind of like a little 4 letters that describes a story. So in my case, it was FATA, like fatal car accident.
Wow.
So I wrote LI FATA 12, which is the date, LI FATA 14, LI FATA 16. I remember talking to my brother. I have a twin brother who's also a Christian, and he's a big part of the story, how I ended up becoming a Christian, about work and life, and we talked about. I was like, I don't know if I'm making a difference. I'm like, I don't know if like this feels like you're making a difference in people's lives, and I wasn't necessarily sure if I felt fulfilled by it. And one of the things that we talked about when I was doing these stories is that we give dignity. It's an opportunity to give dignity to people's lives. I started thinking about writing those stories about car accidents where people died and as essentially being a professional obituary writer, as a chance to give dignity to people's lives. And so I think there's a lot of journalism where you get a chance to do that. When you get further along in your journalism career, you end up having, your career can go a lot of different directions, and you get choices about what you cover. And I became an investigative reporter, and that is a job where every single day you can feel great sense of moral purpose. I wrote a story about that early in my career that won me some awards, about 3 poor Black, people with low IQ who were in prison in Alabama for killing a baby that probably never existed. It's very complicated to explain, but the woman who was accused of killing this baby had her tubes tied, and so it's highly unlikely that she had been pregnant. And so it was a story about forced confession, and the series that I wrote ended up resulting in 2 or 3 of them being freed, and one of them stayed in prison on some unrelated charge. But it's a great privilege to be able to, every single day that you go to work, to feel a sense of purpose.
Have you felt any particular tensions between your faith and the work that you do as a journalist, either as an editor at making editorial decisions or in writing itself?
I mean, the question that I'm always asked is sort of like, oh, like you've worked at the New Yorker or you worked in the New York Times. These are kind of secular, cosmopolitan kind of institutions, and like, what is it like to be a person of faith in that kind of environment? And certainly there have been times when I've experienced the kind of stereotyping of what Christians are and what they believe, and there's some tension there. The thing that I've actually found is the places that I've worked have really valued people who come from all different walks of life, and that's really important for newsrooms as they cover America and the world. And when I was early on, when I was at the New York Times, this was soon after this. They had this scandal involving a reporter named Jason Blair who had made up all these stories, and there was a big effort to improve the credibility of the New York Times, and there was a committee that was formed to do this, and it ended up sort of just looking at a lot of what the Times does, and it talked about this report. They ended up writing a report about it, and they talked about how they needed diversity in all its forms, whether it's people who go to church, whether it's people who are in the military, people of different race and racial and ethnic backgrounds, and so what I have found is that people value that part of what I bring to the job, just in the way that when I look to hire people, I'm looking for people of all different kinds of backgrounds and experiences and skills, and I look for people who have surprising and interesting backgrounds.
You've written some about pluralism. And so obviously from some Christian context, pluralism is seen perhaps as an enemy to be vanquished. And yet you've made the case that pluralism ought to be seen as a social good. So describe for us briefly how you see your own Christian faith and a encouragement of pluralism, a matter of consistency.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that in the democratic project, you need to be able to find ways to allow people to bring their full selves. And, the challenge of this is, I think, when it comes to Christians, I think, is like or other groups, actually, there are people who are making exclusive claims, and how can that be brought to the table? And like the thing that I have, I'm a big fan of some of the folks these days. There's this project run by a guy named Michael Luo called the Center for Christianity and Public Life. And there's another effort that I've written about called the After Party. And these are both kind of efforts to focus less on what the argument is, but the way you argue and the kind of character that you bring to the table, and if you can bring these qualities of empathy and kindness, and all of these things, I think that would go a long way for our democracy, and I think for Christians in the public sphere.
Been talking to Michael Luo, executive editor at The New Yorker, who writes regularly for the magazine on politics, religion, and Asian American issues. Recently released his first book, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. Michael, thanks so much. It's been a delight to talk with you. Grateful for your work and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you.
It has been so delightful to see more and more listeners like you sign up for NSC Plus. Our growing community is made up of intelligent and thoughtful people looking for a holistic approach to human flourishing. Signing up for NSC Plus is also a way to support the show and the work we're doing, and in fact, we depend upon that kind of support. But in addition to supporting the show, you'll get exclusive access to bonus content, and the No Small Endeavor you've come to love will be completely ad-free. In fact, you won't even hear ads like this one. So go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus to become a member of our community today. Join for as little as $5 a month. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com, click on that red button that says Join NSC Plus to become a member today. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carriette Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.